Hello, you're listening to Mapping the Zone, a podcast dedicated to informal context of the works. Nope, informal discussion. Fuck me, man. Thank you for listening to Mapping the Zone, a podcast dedicated to a discussion of the works and context of Thomas Pynchon. My name is Kate.
I'm Cody.
I'm Will.
I'm Luke.
And this week we are discussing chapter 20 of Against the Day. Luke, do you have a summary available for us?
I do. So it is autumn, and Lou is exploring darknesses, both literal and, one assumes, metaphorical. He also is still fighting his addiction to cyclamite, although his weapons in this battle seem to just be other drugs, the partaking of which often finds him joined by Neville and Nigel. One day the pair kidnap him all over again, this time by bustling him into a cab in the early morning hours. The taxi's destination is the War Office, or just a fraction of it, ruled over by Dr. Coombs de Bottle, a sort of mad scientist and overseer of a group of serious girls and gnomes. Lou and the good doctor discuss the realities of existence for anarchists as they watch primitive bombs being disassembled. Then the reason Lou has been brought there is revealed. Great Britain has their own version of the Kieselguhr Kid, the gentleman bomber of Headingley, who disguises himself as a cricket player and throws poison gas grenades disguised as cricket balls. Neville and Nigel reappear with the substance Lou has long been fruitlessly searching for, cyclamite. Lou's British friends share the news of Madame Eskimov's prophecy concerning Great Britain's future success in cricket, and Dr. de Bottle is off to his bookie to place bets. It has been decided for Lou that he will accompany the TWIT's Cohen to a meeting with Professor Renfrew at Cambridge. The muscle for the trip is reintroduced, Clive Crouchmas. His backstory and worldview are explored. We find out that Crouchmas is one of Yashmin's many admirers and has been heavily involved with the Baghdad Railway. Next comes the old question, if someone can see the future, why are they not fabulously rich? This question is more or less said by Crouchmas to the Cohen, who then monologues about the difficulty of achieving enlightenment. Lou and the Cohen and Crouchmas arrive in Cambridge, where they notice some peculiar newspaper headlines and evocative graffiti, a Pynchon favorite. Leaving Yashmin behind, Lou and Crouchmas meet up with Professor Renfrew at a pub known to be frequented by mathematicians. They drink a few rounds of beers there, and Lou and Renfrew make their way up to his quarters, where they discuss Renfrew's unsuccessful attempts to gain attention from Yashmin. Then their conversation turns toward the gentleman bomber of Headingley, and Renfrew brings Lou a portrait of the bomber. Lou is convinced to bring Renfrew the bomber without killing him, even though Renfrew has been warded off the case by the police. Upon the mention of Renfrew's nemesis, Werfner, Renfrew picks up a globe and points out that Eurasia, Africa, and America are connected by the ice around the North Pole. This connection therefore renders Inner Asia of extreme importance to global affairs, at least according to Renfrew. Lou points out that there's more than is dreamt of in Renfrew's philosophy. Namely South America and Oceania. Nonetheless, Renfrew begins to monologue about how history emerges from geography. Lou sits back and lights a cigar. The chapter ends with the Cohen congratulating Lou on his new commission and promising Lou that the TWIT are pure of heart in their intentions, both with him and in general.
Okay, so what did we think of chapter 20?
I enjoyed it. It's kind of like a drug haze of a chapter. I think intentionally, probably so, and then it kind of devolves into the paranoia that Lou starts to feel about the connection between the Kieselguhr Kid and the GBH over on the other side of the globe. It's a fun read. It's more of the noir kind of detective stuff, with Lou as the central figure in it, which I love. And yeah, just kind of short, sweet, not a whole lot of unpacking to do in this chapter, which is nice, especially after last week's. But yeah, it was fun. I enjoyed it.
Yeah, I think it's a fun, easygoing chapter. Not without stuff to research and write about. I do have some notes.
Oh yeah.
But yeah, it's the absurdity of I know they're not twins, but they basically feel like twins.
They do.
The absurdity of the twins throughout this entire kind of like section is continuing to be one of my favorite parts of this book, at least in this juncture. They're so they're almost like there's something like almost slapsticky about them that
They give
I
me the
really
same
enjoy.
vibes as the Saperstein twins from Parks and Rec. Just that,
Yeah.
like, really aloof, goofy, just kind of like flying by the seat of their pants and just always having fun despite being completely ignorant and stupid.
I could see one of them saying, "I have never done anything wrong
Yeah, exactly.
ever." And I think that the absurdity of those characters is equally matched to the absurdity of Renfrew holding a globe like some kind of like megamaniacal,
Super villain, yeah.
sociopath at the end of the chapter. So yeah, I enjoyed it. I enjoyed the fact that it feels sort of light and breezy as opposed to the last one, especially.
Yeah, this chapter is a little bit of a microcosm of the book for me. Despite the fact that it's located in essentially one neighborhood of London and has a pretty small cast, but it has the thing the thing about this book that it blows my mind the most is the way that these most random chapters have some of the most beautiful writing in them.
Yeah.
Like this chapter, every phrase is a poem in this chapter, and it's awesome.
Yeah.
On the other hand, it's also a chapter that has Werfner in it, and as I mentioned last time, not a fan of them. Not a fan of this particular plot line. However, all of in this particular case, there's enough absurdity going on with the way that he is, as indicated by the end of the chapter, trying so hard to manipulate Lou, and Lou is just sitting there catching every single tactic.
Mm-hmm.
It's just deeply entertaining on that level.
Yeah.
At the very least.
It makes him look like an idiot in a way that's really quite lovely.
Yeah.
Definitely.
Yeah, this chapter is probably the most most similar to Inherent Vice of all the chapters we've gotten so far, as y'all have kind of already noted. The noir aspect is definitely big in this chapter. I like this chapter a good amount. It's very fun. There's never a dull moment. Things move along pretty quickly. That being said, Pynchon also kind of gets into some very good descriptive language of the settings and stuff that kind of helps ground you in the scene, like, and kind of is very fun to visualize. I like as I mentioned in the summary, like there's graffiti. And Pynchon doesn't get into that too much. I mean, it is a thing in Gravity's Rainbow with like some of the Lenny Pokler sections. He mentions some graffiti repeatedly. But the Inherent Vice starts off with the epigraph underneath the boardwalks, the beach, which is connected to like situationism and psychogeography. I meant to bring up psychogeography last week because there's a paragraph in chapter 19 that is very about like London and the architecture there. And it's even here in the first paragraph a little bit. But psychogeography is something that I've kind of looked into recently as it relates to situationism and kind of Pynchon. And then also Johann's newest book has the epigraph from Inherent Vice. Johann Harstad's newest book has that same epigraph as its title. So that's just kind of been hanging out in my head for a while. But there's a lot to like about this chapter overall. It is kind of a return to form, I would say.
Do you want to provide like a explainer of psychogeography for the listener, and then kind of go from there if you notice anything related to that as we go through the chapters?
Yeah, sounds good. Psychogeography. I recently read a history of it. I mean, a lot of it is it's a very like English and European thing. I mean, I know that there are international associations centered in places that aren't England and Europe that concern themselves with psychogeography, but it's basically The term psychogeography is basically like the effect on the mind of like artificial landscapes or artificial settings. Specifically, it's mostly centered on going on des rêves, which are like that's the French word for I think wander. So whenever you do a day rêve, you meet up with people, and then you just start walking with no destination in mind, and you try to note the effects of the buildings and the artificial structures, and maybe even like because plants can also be the location of plants can also be planned out in a way that's kind of artificial. So I think that plays into it as well, but it's mostly you're supposed to do it in cities, specifically like downtown areas or areas that are more perhaps industrial or I don't the heyday for psychogeography was mostly in the 50s and 60s, and in the 60s it kind of psychogeography kind of went away. Like the situationist movement was initially focused on psychogeography and kind of more artistic stuff, and I mean psychogeography is technically I guess scientific in some ways, although it's very subjective. But they moved to more like the situationists moved away from psychogeography and a lot more into leftist politics, and a lot of it has a lot of they were like big in the leadership of the I think it's the let me Google it to make sure, but I think it's the May 1968 protests in France, which May 1968, which was a big period of social unrest, in which like leftists and other people went on strike. Like there's like I want to say it was up to a quarter of French workers went on strike at some point. Maybe more than that. I could be. I just don't want to overstate it, but I think it's around that. It's either like a fourth or a third of French workers were eventually went on strike in support of the May 1968 movement. But a big graffiti thing to graffiti during May 1968 was in French, Sous les pavés, la plage, which is underneath the boardwalks, the beach. And that is the epigraph for Inherent Vice. And then there is the graffiti in this chapter. To be specific about this chapter, it doesn't. I can't really. I mean, Create More Dukes seems to be kind of poking fun at the government, and Expropriate Chuckers, has to do with cricket. So it's not directly related to what I'm talking about, but Pynchon. That I feel like it being the epigraph of Inherent Vice, which I think is the next book after this, right? Yeah. It shows that Pynchon had that on his mind.
Cool. Yeah, if you see anything else related to that, like as we go through the rest of this book, feel free to throw it out there.
Yeah, sounds good.
To get into the content of chapter 20, it starts out with sort of Lou continuing to explore London, or at the very least get used to living there. And in one particular case of kind of difficulty in translation or emigration, he's finding is that there's no cyclamite. He hasn't had a good trip in a while, and so he is trying to find any possible sort of substitute for it, or a way to replicate the effects, or make it in some way. This includes a number of different drugs that are listed on the first page of the chapter. Basically crescendoing into xylene, which would mean that he's essentially huffing glue. From a perspective of what I was able to find, the Pynchon wiki for what that chemical compound could be an analog for. But none of these things are really working out for him, unfortunately. Neville and Nigel, we get a glimpse that they have a salary of £100,000 a year, which I don't know what that's from. I'm not sure. I'm not sure what these two do for work. They feel more just like landed gentry to me, which is maybe where that money's coming from. But we learned that that's their yearly salary. I say 100,000. That is because for inflation, £1,000 a year would roughly translate to £100,000. The two of them decide, though, that they are going to take Lou to a place where perhaps these drugs that he wants so desperately could be found. And they introduce it by getting very excited about a particular alcohol that they drink a bottle of a year. For some reason, I feel like Will would have something to say about the concoction they describe imbibing. Do you have any comments on this?
Yeah, I mean, let me hop back a second because I feel like
Okay.
I've made it a policy essentially. Don't puff xylene.
Yeah.
Xylene, yeah. Drugs like that are incredibly toxic. It's a horrible thing. It is the worst thing possible for you. Seriously, if it's between being an alcoholic who also shoots up heroin multiple times a day, do that over puffing xylene. It will be better for your health.
What a bizarre public service announcement.
It's not a joke. It's something like the reason I mention that is just there are a lot of people who try to get sober and end up relapsing with stuff like that. Yeah. Don't relapse. It's better. It's way better for you. You'll be able to get back on your feet sooner.
Yeah. You know what? There's a really good movie that covers what you're talking about. It was called Love, Liza, starring Philip Seymour Hoffman.
Oh God, one of the saddest movies
seriously is
that I've ever seen in my life.
And that's exactly what happens to him is he falls into huffing. I think it was airplane glue, like model airplane glue, and it just completely ruins him.
And I think model airplane glue is probably using xylene or toluene as the solvent. Anyway, but to get back to the point, so the pinky they're talking about, it is I suppose an alcoholic beverage. Basically, Condy's fluid is the way it's described is accurate. It's permanganate disinfectant. Think of it as a cruder version of Lysol. And these days you can find very similar solutions still available for cleaning toilets and stuff because it is permanganates and manganates are really, really, really effective solvents. And by solvent, I get that's a little unfair. They're effective oxidizers. You might have heard of the term chemical burn. You might have experienced a chemical burn some way, somehow. Manganates and permanganates do when people talk about chemical burns, there's many different kinds of chemical burns, and they get conflated a lot. In this exact case, it is doing the exact same thing on a cellular level as burn your flesh. And methylated spirits are alcohols typically distributed for one of two purposes. Either for cleaning, because you can't drink methylated spirits without getting very ill. And, I guess you don't want people buying things for cleaning for other purposes, I guess. But also because you can't get over something like 91%, or at least back in the 1910s, 1900s, 1910s, you definitely couldn't get over 95 or 91% ethanol without including methanol. So for many legitimate industrial and cleaning purposes, very useful to have methylated spirits. However, it's, probably around 5% methanol, which means they will go blind if they drink it at the rate they're talking about.
Yep.
And the permanganates inside that they're mixing into their methylated alcohol mean that they're essentially scorching their insides with it. Like literally, Condy's fluid was prescribed by hacks back in the 1800s for drinking for illnesses and stuff because that was the era it was, and it causes necrosis of the mucous membranes because it is essentially just burning your flesh.
Sounds like a great time.
Don't drink that. I can't imagine it even feeling good. It sounds like a really good way to kill yourself. And by really good, I mean extremely painful and slow.
Reading that about what that was when I was reading about it, the first thing that came to mind, I don't know if y'all are familiar with the story behind this, but I think it was Ween's second album, The Pod. They cropped an image of Leonard Cohen from like his greatest hits album or something like that and put this weird device over his head. And they sort of circulated this rumor that they had spent the entire production of the album getting high on Scotchgard because that was the most like scuzzball shit they could possibly think of. And they had to actually come out later and be like, please don't do that. We weren't doing that. We just said it because it was the worst thing we could think of. But that's what my mind immediately went to. Is like, that's pretty much the same kind of thing.
Yeah, that'll fuck you up even worse because you're just inhaling a bunch of PFAS as well into your body with Scotchgard specifically. Oh Christ. We figure out that this evil concoction is being produced at the War Office. And so Neville and Nigel take Lou to the War Office, and of course we're treated to some wonderful description of London, which exists sort of all through this chapter. And once they're there, they introduce Lou to Dr. Coombs de Bottle, which is just a crazy name. We don't really have much to go on, but does anyone have any big impressions or interpretations of Coombs de Bottle?
Sadly not.
Yeah.
I don't have.
Yeah,
I mean, I love his name.
He's an eccentric guy for sure.
His whole introduction, especially the paragraph that starts with electrical arcs, it did kind of remind me of the way that like James Bond, walking through MI6 would then be led into like some room where this kind of crazy, doctor or scientist would introduce him to all these like weird weapons and stuff. Those scenes, it did kind of remind me of that. That's not a 1-to-1 comparison, and maybe I'm just thinking that because it's both. Yeah, is that the name of it? The name of the person
in James Bond? Yeah,
yeah, it's kind of like that to me. That's what it reminded me of, at least.
Yeah, that's a good. I don't think I noticed that upon reading it, but that's a good analog as he's like taking him through the War Office and explaining that basically all they do there is disassemble and try and reassemble bombs, as far as I can understand. On 235, it says Dr. de Bottle had led them back into a distant bay where technicians were working at tables covered with homemade bombs in different stages of disassembly. Our theory was to begin with devices confiscated from various failed bomb attempts, and then kindly passed along to us, and by careful analysis of each device to return, step by step, to its original act of construction, which proved usually to have been carried out in such appallingly primitive conditions that one began actually to feel sympathy for these wretches. They blow themselves up at quite an alarming rate, you know. Ignorance of proper solvent procedure alone accounting for dozens of anarchist lives each year, just here in London. One must indeed suppress the missionary urge to go out among them, perhaps distributing inexpensive pamphlets outlining for them even the simplest principles of lab safety. It would ever do so much good, don't you think? That last sentence I underlined and said, this is a distinctly English concept. The idea that you would be upset with someone doing something incorrectly, even if it's something as, as crude, for lack of a better term, as creating bombs for, anarchist bombings, that you'd create pamphlets trying to educate them on lab safety, is just a moment of absurdity in this chapter that really made me laugh quite hard.
Yeah.
If everyone's willing to tolerate a bit of conspiracy corner.
Absolutely.
I've got a reading on that. Basically, this is like looking at what's going on in this operation. It's not very unlike the way that the people working in the MK Ultra program in the CIA were talking about their use and distribution of various drugs. Which I'm only taking the liberty to conflate these because of the fact that there's literally a drug made out of explosives in this book.
Sure, that's fair.
And so I don't know. It does feel like there is some kind of connection to MK Ultra in that regard because that is how a lot of the scientists were working. They were basically thinking, look, sure, we don't want people using all the drugs they want. But most of the people working for the CIA weren't exactly especially in the MK Ultra program, weren't exactly normal government men. They
No.
were a lot of strange people, and they were totally the kind of people that, for example, one operative who was, I think he's been identified, but I don't remember who in particular, but he was known as Dr. Acid, and he literally just hung out in Haight-Ashbury during the Summer of Love and the years prior, running around, basically very clearly being a like an actual doctor who was just high all the time and constantly distributing drugs, but also constantly like resuscitating people from overdoses and giving people stuff to bring them down from bad trips. And this was, it was just, I don't know, it's just kind of what happened in the 50s and 60s with that program. But also, this is, I think based on the data publication, the 2006, this is very much in vogue in London in the early 2000s for the UK government to distribute testing kits for drugs, to give grants for safe drug usage sites at raves and music festivals. And so this was something that happened a lot in the early 2000s with drugs with the UK government, where they were actually going around making sure people who were using the drugs that the government insisted were so bad for you that they had to be banned under force of murder if it comes to it. But they were funding all of these safety measures just to make sure that people weren't dying at raves due to some lazy lab techniques.
I'm glad to hear that my thought that this is a distinctly English concept is not far from reality. From there, we are introduced to a strange platter of muffins. I can't make heads or tails of what the deal with the muffins is. It just seems like a crazy thing to ingest, not unlike the insane, I'm going to continue to call it alcohol because what else do you call it?
Yeah.
Concoction that Nigel and Neville. I'm just going to keep calling them Nivel, and they're one person basically.
They're the Brangelina of the book.
Yeah, that they ingest there. So it doesn't surprise me if there's also weird chemical muffins that they have. Anyone have any thoughts on the muffins before we talk about the gentleman bomber?
Have anything on the muffins themselves? It's just one of those things that I started thinking about it this morning. I was like, I can't spend too much time thinking about this, or I'm going to spend all of my time thinking about this. And there's probably really not much there other than it's just a fun MacGuffin to have.
Fair.
Yeah, I don't have anything on the muffins. I do have something from 234, like what we were just talking about.
Yeah.
But the part with Whitehall, owing to a stubborn belief in Whitehall that the eccentric enjoy access to paranormal forces, nothing better to than whisper suggestions for ever more improved weapons design, etc. That's very reminiscent of the White Visitation in Gravity's Rainbow.
Yeah,
that's very true.
And it does seem to be kind of like pointing out the perhaps fictional. I mean, it is a fictional entity, but kind of pointing out the beginnings of it. In this book, and then how it kind of grew into a bigger thing by World War II. And afterwards in some governments and the American government.
Yeah, that's a good call out, Luke.
Yeah, I agree. The muffins though, I do think are genuinely mostly a simple joke, because they're described as turquoise and purple, a lovely shade of purple. However, I have not actually baked with tannins like this. I have seen the products of people who bake with tannins like this, and it is much more of like a palish fuchsia magenta color than it is like a deep royal purple or anything, although it totally could be. Like the kind of purple you're looking at there is the kind of thing that you'd see in poi. Any of our listeners or y'all are familiar with that?
Sure. Okay.
So it's magenta and lime green again, just slightly
I was
township.
just gonna say, so we get another. This. What you're pointing out is that this is another case of magenta and lime green.
But also, I do think it is more or less the general vibe of, well, food's getting weird. We have chemistry. We understand what makes something dangerous or not. We now know that like the things that make or the chemicals that make things purple in nature are not dangerous to us. So why don't we just fill our food with them? It looks pretty. And a little jab at the end there towards the way that preserved blueberries tend to look in muffins, I think.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. I mean, I guess if you can eat a magenta and turquoise muffin, why wouldn't you eat a magenta and turquoise muffin?
It's a fair question.
Sure beats a random shade of brown.
Yeah.
Just imagining the texture, it's probably like weirdly hard.
Yeah.
Like probably is.
Because tannins are acids, so to get the amount of color you're getting out of this, or at least is implied, you're probably putting like a cup of lemon juice worth of acidity in there.
Jesus.
Mm-hmm.
It's just gonna be weird and horrible.
The blueberries will really cut through, I think.
Yeah, they need it.
Yeah. So in between, sandwiched between the mention of the muffins on a cart and the end of the conversation about the muffins, in which Nivel does not like the fact that they're all being consumed without their consent. In the middle, we are introduced to someone known as the Gentleman Bomber of Headingley. His introduction here is pretty great, where it says, he gingerly held up a cricket ball, which all but glowed beneath the electric lighting. For some time now, county pitches throughout England and Wales have been visited by a mysterious figure in white flannels, known around this shop as the Gentleman Bomber of Headingley, after the only known photograph of him with the usual cricketer's bag slung from one shoulder, inside of which he carries a number of spherical hand bombs disguised as cricket ball. This is one that we've managed to recover intact. Rubbing it against one's trousers will activate the arming device inside. You'll notice, perhaps, that it's far shinier, which brought back the whole joke about the pool ball to me.
I wrote that down in my book. I was like, did he also make the exploding pool balls?
You'll notice perhaps that it's far shinier and rather more tightly stitched than a British ball, rather like the Australian ball or kookaburra. And as the Ashes is currently in progress and passion's apt to be running high, Australians, with whom we are somewhat overrun at the moment, may be serving as an unwitting species of cover for the old GB of H, as well as easy targets of blame. And then I just love that Lou's response to this is, he throws bombs during cricket games? Just like complete incredulosity at the concept of what he's talking about. And it turns out that they're actually not bombs in the traditional sense that Lou would be used to. They're actually filled with a poison gas called phosgene. Phosgene would kill roughly 85,000 people in World War I. It is one of the many sort of chemical warfare implements or gases that were used in the trench warfare during that particular conflict. I found some pretty cool old propaganda posters that are meant to warn soldiers about it. One of which has like an elephant, like basically keeping itself from breathing in by just like sucking on its own trunk, essentially. And it has that very like old school propaganda font on it that I love, of just like dramatic big arched letters from that period. We also get a Cody.
Sorry, not to cut you off there, but to bring something up that I found when I was looking into phosgene. That's actually that the use of that particular gas, I think, is very intentional here, because that gas has a smell like fresh grass when it's burned. So that would be the perfect thing to use in a wide field with a bunch of grass that would have just been trimmed before a match, so that less people are likely to notice that there's something amiss and are more likely to stay where they are, allowing the gas to take effect.
Yeah, that's a good point. We also get a brief reference to the ashes. If people do not know what these are, the ashes are a biannual series of test cricket matches between England and Australia. They were dubbed
cricket in this chapter.
Yeah, there's a lot of cricket in this chapter. one of those sports that I just could not care about.
Yeah, I have tried, and I just
It was dubbed so after Australia's first win on English soil, which happened in 1882. A satirical article was then written saying that cricket had, quote, died and the ashes were taken to Australia. When England eventually regained the title, the team captain was gifted an urn with the ashes of a cricket bale inside, with a joke by the Australian team that it contained the ashes of Australian cricket. That little urn, you can look at photos of it. It's like 10 centimeters tall. It's tiny. It is in like against maybe popular belief, the urn is not like traded back and forth. They have a separate trophy for this particular event that they do. But the urn was privately held by the family of that English team captain for a long time, but I think now it's in a museum that you can see. There have been 73 Ashes series in total. Australia currently leads 35 to 32 or 34 to 32. So they're still doing better, which makes the references in this chapter quite funny. Anything that we want to mention at the top with the Gentleman Bomber or Phosgene or anything like that?
The whole thing does kind of remind me of the Green Goblin.
Totally.
Spider-Man.
That's
For
fair.
Spider-Man. I think the movie, I forget, he's in the first two, right? Or at least the first
The
one,
first
which
one.
would have been out, by the time this was being written.
Yeah.
I was like 12 at the time or something, so it was very much like a formative movie for me. Not that I'm not like that into like superhero stuff, but I really do love that first Spider-Man movie. It does kind of remind me of that. I mean, not like a lot, but I mean, I think the Green Goblin throws like ball-shaped bombs that are sometimes gas is, what I can pull from that.
Yeah, his pumpkin bomb. There's a great piece of early CGI in that Sam Raimi Spider-Man where he throws a real bomb, and for some reason it causes the three people that get hit by it to just turn into skeletons. It's one of the funniest early digital effects that I have still seen in a movie. That is also a pretty formative movie for me as well. It's one of the first like theater experiences I had that I like fully remember being like excited for and getting tickets and everything.
It's been a really long time since I saw the movie, so I don't remember that at all. With them incinerating, but that is the most Sam Raimi thing I've ever heard.
It isn't even just that they incinerate and they like their arms are raised screaming even as they're skeletons.
Of course.
And then suddenly all of the bones fall down in a pile. It's
Excellent.
it is maybe the most Sam Raimi moment in that movie. Maybe even all three of them.
That's funny.
From the mention of the bomber here, and after the muffins have been cleaned up, it turns out that Nivel have managed to assemble a very large brick of cyclamite for Lou, and they're decided they're going to give it to him because it's birthday. And when Lou tries to figure out whose idea this was, they make a mention of him being a Gemini. Okay, this is maybe weird conspiracy corner shit, but to my knowledge of astrology, this sent off like alarm bells because the Gemini sign is associated with doubling a lot. It seems to be a pretty intentional choice by Pynchon in my mind to make him a Gemini, because that star sign represents the twins Castor and Pollux from Roman mythology, and there is often a lot of conversation around people who are Geminis, if you're really into astrology, that they almost have two faces or two personalities, two sides of the coin, so to speak, with someone who's a Gemini. And Lou is certainly a good representation of that. He is potentially occupied three worlds at this point in the book. The one where he committed a crime, the one that we meet him in, and then this one in London, if indeed he's skipping through these sort of universal barriers or metaphysical barriers into other realities. But even just from a standpoint of that idea of he committed a crime and he doesn't remember what he is, and it's so heinous and so evil, but he doesn't remember, that could be a case of this like thematic idea of two people inhabiting one body, one whom is committing these heinous acts and one who just like doesn't understand them and can't relate to them. And then I went a little bit deeper for no reason and continued reading in that in Babylonian astrology, the Gemini constellation is associated with the Mighty King and the one who has arisen from the underworld. Those are the two titles they give to the stars that make up the constellation. And both of those titles have to do with the worship of Nurgle, the god of inflicted death, who is associated with war, death, and disease in particular. The names themselves seem to portray two sides of the same coin. The Mighty King and the one who's arisen from the underworld don't on their face seem like they'd be describing the same person. But what lies beneath both of those is this god that is evil, or at the very least associated with evil acts or heinous acts or something inherently bad. Obviously, these things, when you're talking in like deific ways, the same sense of morality doesn't apply, but from a human perspective. And so Lou is an individual who may have committed something that heinous and that evil to be seen as the upstate, downstate beast, but it doesn't feel like that could come from him. And I think that some of that also relates to his sense of not necessarily remorse, but like his conflicted moral judgment with everything that he had been doing in America in the first place, from working for the Pinkertons and working for White City investigations and breaking up these labor movements that he comes to be sympathetic for. There's this feeling of like, I don't know if I'm doing the right thing here, but there's something beneath the surface there that keeps motivating him to work with this, awful organization that's committing bad acts. So, just some interesting sort of background to what his astrological sign is and how that can relate to him as a character that I was able to stumble upon.
So I'd like to ask you a question in that
Sure.
particular Babylonian astrology avenue. Did you happen to see whether there are associations with Gilgamesh and those and the Gemini sign?
No, that I didn't. I should have done.
Just-
I should have done that additional research.
Yeah, because the reason I'm bringing it up, and I think this is relevant, because the beginning of the Epic of Gilgamesh, essentially the prelude is Gilgamesh being a horrible king who takes, right of prima nocta, etc., to abuse his people, and then his entire quest is about trying to get to the underworld and come back. And I do think that kind of does line up with Lou as this guy who's beginning to his story that we know is some horrible act that even he's not aware.
Yeah.
Who's in this weird pit of drug abuse and people manipulating him, I guess.
Yeah, agreed. That's a great additional place to take it. Moving on from there, we get a reference to Madame Eskimov providing predictions on the upcoming Ashes series, in which she says that if the English team focuses on this particular bowler, I believe is what they're called, then the way that he is going to particularly throw the ball is going to be unpredictable, and it's going to be too hard for the Australians to hit, and it's going to be a victory. That is exactly what happened. If you research the history of the Ashes, England did win in the 1903-1904 Ashes series, and it was largely due to that key figure that Madame Eskimov mentions, where they had a way of throwing the ball that just made it really unpredictable as far as what the ball was going to do, and the I don't know what they call the guy who holds the paddle. I know it's a I know it's a bat, but Sport is so crazy.
No, he's literally called the batsman.
Is he called the
Oh,
batsman?
is it?
Okay.
Okay.
Yeah.
Yeah.
That like the way that the ball was thrown made it really difficult for the batsman to predict what it was going to do. And that was sort of a new sort of phase of cricket strategy, which led them to win that particular series. Anything and all that we have on the war room before we go into kind of the Oxford or Cambridge. Sorry, I know that's a controversial thing to mix up. The Cambridge section of the chapter.
Someone's gonna come at us real hard.
The Doctor Strangelove reference, I think, is pretty there. Because, like, if anyone's going to be used to make that kind of a reference, I think it's Nivel.
That would make sense.
Yeah.
So from there, it was decided that Lou should go up to Cambridge with the Cohen and meet Professor Renfrew. And this is where we are reintroduced to Clive Crouchmas, who was present in spirit but not body at the seance from the end of the previous chapter, in which we talked about the Berlin-Baghdad Railway. And our introduction to him includes the following line. Earlier in his career, Clive Crouchmas had been your bog-standard public official, unreflectively ambitious but not yet as greedy as he would soon find it possible to be. He worked at the Ottoman Public Debt Administration, an international body which the Turkish Sultan had authorized some years before to collect and distribute tax revenue as a way of restructuring the debt of his overextended empire. In theory, the PDA took the taxes on sales of fish, alcohol, tobacco, salt, silk, and stamps, the so-called 6 indirect contributions, and passed the money on to various bondholders in Britain, France, Austria-Hungary, Germany, Italy, and Holland. No one acquainted with the second law of thermodynamics, however, would have expected a perfect transfer of funds. Some of those Turkish pounds would always be lost in the process, creating opportunities that would have taken someone much farther along the ill-marked path to sainthood than Clive Crouchmas to pass up. So, this is a real organization, and Pynchon does give a good enough description of kind of how they worked that you get the sense. But I did some additional research, as I am one to do, because this is one of the most insane concepts for a government bureau that I've ever come across. I'm sure there's crazier one, but just reading how this happened was an experience in and of itself. The Turkish Sultan, the one thing I quibble with in Pynchon's description, did not approve the creation of the OPDA. He was essentially strong-armed into it because of how much debt the Ottoman Empire had, and how it seemed as though they were not going to be able to pay back the greater Western power. So this organization was a real organization that was established in 1881 by those greater European powers in order to collect payments which the Ottoman Empire owed to European companies and private interests, as well as public debt owed to the government. So it functioned in both realms of society. The Ottoman public debt that had begun to pile up, particularly as a result of a series of bad public loans that they couldn't pay back. As we talked about a lot in the last episode, the reason why the Ottoman Empire ended up in this situation is it really just overextended itself to a point where it couldn't administer properly from border to border. And also, as soon as it started to take on a higher non-Muslim population, there were some very, very difficult legal implications and also just societal implications for a majority Muslim population at that time in living in the same empire as non-Muslim Christian people. So, as we talked about, they started to decline and really were being propped up just as a power check with Russia. That's really the only reason why these Western powers wanted the Ottoman Empire to still succeed. And I think the OPDA is such an interesting part of this history because, yes, it was technically created as a way to try and keep the Ottoman Empire afloat and to kind of prop up this old man of the East to fight against Russia, but at the same time became one of the sort of vestigial organs that bled it to death. So it really got swinging after the end of the Crimean War, which, if we remember, the Russians wanted revenge for their losses in the Crimean War, which really led to that Russo-Turkish War that led to all of the other stuff that we talked about last week. And so with the rising debt and the rising inability for them to pay, the OPDA became a vast independent bureaucracy within the Ottoman bureaucracy, run by the creditors of the empire. So there's very little actual government interest or oversight. There's a guy who sits on the board who's a member of the Ottoman Empire, but he's one guy, and he is joined by representatives from England, France, Germany, Austria, Hungary, Italy, Denmark, and then private Ottoman banks. So he's way sort of out of majority with the rest of the governing body of this organization. It had 5,000 independent officials who went throughout the empire collecting taxes, but its peak employment was 9,000 people, which far outnumbered the actual imperial finance ministry. So the people whose jobs it was to administer taxes and to administer the actual finances of the empire, they're outpaced in employment by 2-3 times with this one random debt collection agency that exists attached to the Ottoman Empire. By 1900, the administration was financially responsible for propping up a lot of railways and industrial projects, and it had monopolies allowed on salt and tobacco. It also allowed, by its charter, minor monopolies in certain states to collect on stamps, alcohol, fishing, and silk. But that was just in certain regions. So when I say minor monopoly, what that essentially means is like all of the money you make off of that goes to the OPDA if you live in this region of the Ottoman Empire, but not in this region. They would also be allowed to eventually collect on the indemnities paid to the Ottoman Empire by the Balkan states after the Congress of Berlin. So even in the case of like money flowing to the government to repay, fallout from the actual conflicts in the time, the OPDA just vacuumed up all of that money as well. And essentially, how this worked is these tax collectors would just go prop themselves up at villages or in marketplaces, and they would just say, "Hey, you're selling this product. You owe us tax on that. Gimme." Is basically how they would do that. And then they would take the money back with them to the headquarters of the OPDA, where it would, in theory, get counted up and then pay down a debt. The problem with this, however, is the amount of money that had flowed into the Ottoman Empire this time, either through public loans, through private loans, through debt due to international conflict, and all the rest, it almost, reading about it, it almost took on like a Lovecraftian aspect of this big debt that is crushing. It's both propping you up and killing you from a perspective of the outside investment into your country. But it also doesn't have a number. It doesn't even really have like a solid form to it. But it's just all consuming, and it is something that is constantly feeding on not just the government but the individual people. And it was so hard to estimate and to work with what the OPDA was owed, especially because, of course, like its own expenses were getting charged back to the government, that the OPDA, it is understood by modern scholars, was more than paid back for all of its debt, possibly 4 times, 5 times as much as what they were owed. But they, as soon as they existed, they're not just going to like stop shuffling free money back to the imperial core of Europe. So they just kept toting up different bills, and they just kept toting up different, taxes that were owed or interest that was owed. And they just kept doing that over and over and over again until eventually the empire dissolved. The OPDA outlived the Ottoman Empire to the point that once the Ottoman Empire was over and done with, they had a bunch of these tax revenue stamps that were in circulation that were basically in use across the Ottoman Empire as bonds or backed securities, and the OPDA overwrote all of these treasury stamps and these tax stamps with their own logo, saying that they would back the value of them. So the OPDA not only like fed off the corpse of the Ottoman Empire for so long that once it finally actually like killed it and put it in the ground, it was still ensuring the money that it was supposedly collecting on, which is so crazy to me. Like this concept is something that feels so distinctly Pinchonian that I was having a hard time believing that it was real, because like and obviously it is, but like it so speaks to the time and the place of what the power of these major Western powers was at the time, not just from a colonial perspective, but also just from the influence that they could exert, where just like a group of random private interests backed by the government could force their way into the Ottoman Empire and be like, yeah, no, you're not going to pay us back in a time that we like, so we're just going to send people out to collect our money for us, and we're not going to tell you how much you owe. We're just going to tell you when we're done. Like that's the mafia. That's mafia shit. Like them doing them doing like a bust out at somebody's store because of gambling debt. Like it's so crazy to me, but I think it's also in league with what we talked about in the last chapter. It's so perfect for this idea of like the creation of the capital T they. Like watching those entities rise up and start to take their place in the world, as opposed to stuff that seems like it would make actual logical sense in the government. And how a lot of that all comes down to money, and it all comes down to commerce, and is driven by these special interests. It's an absolutely crazy piece of history that I did not know about, and that I had a wild time reading about, but loved that Pynchon included, because of the fact that it illustrated to me in a way that I think a lot of the other stuff did, but less esoterically, just how insane this time was in human history. And also because you can buy OPDA stamps still. They're pretty cheap, so I ordered
Really?
I ordered some. They're from the turn of the century, from like Palestine. And sure enough, it's one of these old tax stamps, and it has the OPD's logo overwritten on top of it. It's crazy. You can get them. Yeah, they're like $5. That's how ubiquitous they were back then.
Wow.
Yeah.
So let me get this straight. So what you're saying is that foreign-owned privatized tax collection services are not good.
No, I think they're pretty bad.
Okay, all right. Well, I guess that's that plan down the drain. If only I could run an entire mafia. Yep.
Yeah.
You'll get there.
Have 9,000 independent tax collectors going out just grabbing random amounts of money from ordinary citizens,
Mhm.
and then maybe you're getting what they asked for. Who knows? Like when Clive Crouchmas is described as someone who didn't understand the depths of greed until he worked for the OPDA, that makes perfect sense, because these people could have easily just been like, yeah, you owe me 32 whatever unit of currency they had in the Ottoman Empire, and then only give 5 to the OPDA because that's what, they just say they collected. The lack of oversight on the whole thing was insane. Speaking of which, what do we think of Clive Crouchmas as a character? The conversation that he has with the Grand Cohen, I think, is like just such a perfect analog for the time where like spiritualism is dying and
Yeah.
commerce is taking its place. But there's a lot of detail that we're given about his character.
I actually find him pretty interesting. He does seem to some of his character traits seem to point to a type of spirituality that was in vogue in the 60s and 70s, more so than like the 1960s and the 1970s. In a way that just those like were kind of the heyday of it. I mean, just the he does seem to be a bit like you could, because he's like so involved in business and all this stuff, but then he's also, he seems to run in very odd circles for a businessman. Where he's hanging out with all these different like occult groups, and he's not giving attention to women that he views as frivolous or whatever. Where he does kind of run against type in a way. I mean, I'm not an expert in the social lives of businessmen in the 1900s in Europe. But I think you get what I'm saying. Where he does seem to run against the grain in some ways, and to be more curious about spiritual stuff, even if it's stated that he wouldn't recognize any appearance of the metaphysical, even in the act of morsis fundamento, which just means even if it bit him in the ass, basically. But he's still very interested in spiritual. He's still very interested in spirituality. Even if it's seems to be somewhat, like at the end of this section, he asks if he reaches a certain level of enlightenment, then will get a discount on being a TWIT member.
Yeah.
Which is pretty funny. And it's it seems to be. It doesn't seem like a calculated it doesn't seem like somebody asking for a raise. It's like just kind of innocently, kind of childlike being, asking kind of dumbass questions that are comedic. I like him a good amount. I don't know. He's a fun character.
He is.
Does anyone remember the character in Gravity's Rainbow who was like Slothrop's essentially uncle, who organized the deal between his parents and whatever the character's name is? Anyway, that's the vibe I get from Crouchmas. Essentially, just a pure opportunist who's happy to use whatever comes his way to get ahead. But also just a weird note, maybe not relevant for the episode, but I recently learned that Scott Adams, the author and illustrator of Dilbert,
yeah,
left Christianity because it couldn't teach him how to tell the future.
Well, I got enough problems with that guy.
Well, yeah,
at least of my issues with him.
Oh, absolutely. It's just that it seems like there's a kind of
weird
person.
Yeah. Now I'm gonna forever link Clive Crouchmas to Scott Adams.
You're welcome. I am sorry for that.
Yeah, well, and I think that he is an interesting character. I agree with you, Luke, in that I like him a lot because he's super transparent in how self-interested that he is, and that can be an entertaining thing all on its own. But I think it also, as a kind of reference, I feel like it is a good reflection in a character of this changing tide, where he's probably a member of TWIT or these other organizations because that was a thing for a while, that if you joined those metaphysical societies, it was great networking. Like, you got all sorts of opportunities, and you also got to wear like cool costumes, and like pretend that you were doing spells and stuff, which is like a great deal, right? But the longer that you kind of push into modernity, and the longer that you push more towards this like capitalistic, money driven campaign, the less that magical stuff becomes part of sort of the history of these people meeting with one another. Of course, there are certain conspiracy theorists who would disagree with that, but it I think shows this transitioning, where when he's talking to the Cohen, this conversation I really like. If someone wants to start on 238 with "It's too good to pass up," and then read through to the end of the section before the page break.
It's too good to pass up, he groaned aloud to Grand Cohen Nookshaft, his spiritual advisor. Isn't it? I'm thinking, said the Cohen, whose money had been in 3% consoles for longer than he could remember or remember why. I'm thinking. I've never understood, said Clive Crouchmas, why, with all the precognitive talent around this place, no one has ever... He paused as if seeking a diplomatic way to go on. Some serious dissonance between physical gifts and modern capitalism, I'd imagine, said the Cohen, somewhat shortly. Mutually antagonistic, you'd have to say. We also do not try to become too mental, like some in your own shop over this railway concession. Were I not out here walking free amongst you all, declared Clive Crouchmas, I should be best boy at Colney Hatch. The other night, for just a half a second, I thought I saw It's all right, Crouchmas. One hears this sort of thing all the time. But enlightenment is a dodgy proposition. It all depends on how much you want to risk. Not money so much as personal safety, precious time against a very remote long shot coming in. It happens, of course. Out of the dust, out of the clouds of sweat and breath, the drumming of hooves, the animal rises up behind the field, the last you'd have expected, tall, shining, inevitable, and passes through them all like a beam of morning sunlight through the spectral residue of a dream. But it's still a fool's bet and a mug's game, and you might not have the will or the patience. But suppose I did stick it out. I've been curious for some time. As members here move closer to enlightenment, is there any sort of discount on the dues we pay?
It's a great conversation between the two of them because
Yeah.
you can analyze whether the Grand Cohen is, actually speaking wisdom at any point that he's talking, right? Like you can say that he's just full of it and that this whole organization is crazy. And I don't think you'd necessarily be wrong for doing that. But it is clear that he is trying to do something. Like he is aiming towards something that means some higher truth to him. At least that's how it appears. And he is trying to provide some kind of spiritual counseling to this other guy that the reason why we don't use our sort of foresight or our powers to just make money is because that isn't the point of any of this. Like the point of what we're doing here is some degree of enlightenment to move past those requirements. But this younger individual who I assume organization and maybe sees it as that opportunity to expand his business through influence or through networking or whatever, or maybe did have some inkling of real desire towards enlightenment when he entered, can only see the bottom line and can only see this in context of what it does for his largesse. And I just think this conversation is a really good, nuanced but not understandable sort of look at the stuff that Pynchon has been describing for a couple chapters now.
Mhm.
And I really loved this sort of being the heart of this chapter, so to speak, before we transition to the meeting at Cambridge.
There's something about the dialogue that reminds me of the plays of Samuel Beckett as well.
Oh,
It's
sure.
a little bit more ornate, and some of the paragraphs are longer. But especially the Cohen saying "I'm thinking." That just reminds me of Waiting for Godot specifically. I think a character says that a good amount in that play. I could be wrong. I know there's at least one play where people will say out loud, "I'm thinking," like to seemingly buy time in the conversation. Yeah, I mean, it's like I already said. I find that whole conversation very comedic and fun to read.
Yeah, I mean, I think the general the idea about you know being psychic, any kind of soothsaying and getting rich is one of those fun it's a fun thing throughout history, the way that different cultures handle it. And it is interesting to see here this like you said, Kate, this description of the transition between a period of spirit into a spirit of or into a period of capital.
Mhm.
Just trying to grapple with that kind of what seems to be an eternal issue for humanity.
Yeah, that's very true. Can someone explain to me the joke? I like this section where it first starts and it has the another encyclical from Professor McTaggart thing. The Pynchon wiki claims that this isn't this announcement is an allusion to some kind of logic joke, and then links to supposedly an explanation of that joke, and I don't get it. I don't know if it
It's
just
over
went
my
over
head.
my head
No,
or
I got nothing on it. It is completely over my head.
okay.
Give me a second. I actually just missed that link in Ancient Wiki. The joke is that in the world of formal logic, when you're formal logic is mathematics, but it's
Mhm.
essentially trying to map concepts into mathematics. And so in formal logic, numbers are representative of both propositions and things. And so if 1 plus 1 equals 1, what that implies is that since every operation is either from like a basic implication level, or like a definitional level, built on addition, essentially that means that any operation that you do on an object using that logic is equivalent to any other proposition. So that means that if there is one, if 1 plus 1 equals 1, then there is no difference between any other number because all of the numbers equal 1. And if the numbers are representing the papacy, or if the numbers are representing the person talking, then that means that if you take that for granted, that literally any statement is by definition true, because every statement is, from the standpoint of Bertrand Russell and Alfred North Whitehead, every statement can be pared down into a logical proposition if you break logic by making everything equivalent to everything else. There is no false statement.
Okay. I have details on the references to the people in the announcement. Do we have any thoughts on just this or the graffiti that is up as far as create more dukes and expropriate chuckers?
Sorry, yeah, the create more dukes. I do kind of link that, at least in my head. I don't really know too much about the history of British bureaucracy, but it does seem to be just kind of a comment on bureaucratic bloat, and perhaps an ineffectual government that is giving people titles rather than, or focus on giving people titles rather than governing, stuff like that. Expropriate chuckers. There isn't anything on the pension wiki about that. I thought it was about cricket, just off the top of my head, but expropriate apparently means to take somebody's property. And I could actually see it being like some type of like meta or like some type of in joke with pension where like, somebody's name is Charles and they're called Chuck and then Chucky and then Chuckers. It could be a name, because it's all capital, so it's not clear if it's a name or not. That's just kind of my little conspiracy corner theory is that it could just be a hyper personal version of graffiti. Like me and some of my friends in college used to write our other friend's name was here on people's like dirty windshields and stuff, and that person never actually did that. We did that for him, just as like a joke, just something like that,
Sure. I gotcha.
Yeah, I get kind of like it's on kind of doubled meaning with the cricket interpretation, I think, makes the most sense in terms of like trying to imagine why people would actually write this graffiti. It's just like it's fundamentally kind of getting at the same reason why was it Darby? Was it No, not Darby. One of the chums of chance mentioned that because Lou reads the sports pages, they don't need to worry about him being an anarchist. And I think it's kind of just a joke on that, basically, that this is what the British people are preoccupied with, is all this cricket nonsense. On top of that, create more dukes. If you do read it as a political call, it is in the same way that the people who read the sports pages don't care about politics. This is like this is like a moron's idea of democracy, right? Or of fairness in politics. Like, sure, dukes are useful. Dukes are, they're in charge of this particular section of land. So if we have more dukes, then that means we have more representation in the House of Lords. And that also goes into the expropriate chuckers thing, because I could totally see it being like some specific name pun, but it could also be like very, very basic Cockney rhyming slang for, fuckers, and just like a generic anti-people protest graffito.
So the the sort of posted artwork, the another encyclical portion, has two names in it. Professor McTaggart refers to John McTaggart. John McTaggart Ellis McTaggart is his full name, which is crazy. An English metaphysician who taught at Trinity College in Cambridge. He is most famous for a wide variety of work on Hegel and for his 1908 theory on the unreality of time. G.H. Hardy refers to Godfrey Harold Hardy, who was a renowned mathematician responsible for work in the fields of pure mathematics and mathematical analysis. He is also known as the mentor of Ramanujan, who was an Indian man who was a mathematical prodigy without the aid of traditional education. He is also well known for the Hardy-Weinberg principle, in which he states that allele and genotype frequencies remain constant from generation to generation in the absence of evolutionary influences. So, two guys that do some period setting, but that also are pretty responsible, or pretty majorly responsible for developments in mathematics and philosophy. Anyone have anything that they want to add on those two beyond just the basic biographical data?
I mean, the Pynchon Wiki does note that McTaggart in real life apparently argued that time does not exist as we seem to experience it. I don't know basically anything about the philosophical reasoning behind that, but it is a concept that I've heard people talk about, just kind of, in conversation. It's an interesting thing to think about. It's on its head, just off the top of my head. It seems like a very Pynchonian thing to believe and or to focus on, just because it's hard to prove. It strikes me at least, and again, I don't know much about the all the philosophical, foundation of the idea. It strikes me as just very Pynchonian and stuff. So,
I'm not gonna try to get into Hegelian stuff. But the Hardy is notable in particular with regard to Pynchon because of how much of his work is about issues of complex analysis and population distributions. Like he, so much of the mathematics in Gravity's Rainbow and Bleeding Edge are just those subjects essentially, and it's relevant. I don't know if it's any deeper than the fact that he was talking about the kind of stuff that like Pynchon probably had to study in the Signal Corps even after going to school.
Yeah. We also get a detail that they go to a mathematician's pub beside a canal called the Laplacian. There's some arguing about who that might be about in the Pynchon Wiki. I think it probably has to do with Pierre-Simon Laplace. He was referred to as the Newton of France and one of the most influential early figures in the development of math and astronomy in the 17 and 1800s, including a massive contribution to calculus. He is also responsible for the sort of proof of God that we now call as Laplace's demon, and some of the first theories on the existence of black holes. The guy's influence is all over the place. But it's just sort of set dressing for the scene. So not necessarily necessary to talk through everything that he contributed to the worlds of mathematics and astrophysics and science. But a cool guy nonetheless. From there, we are introduced to the professor himself. He shows up in almost a beatific vision where it says, slowly through the impure fenlight, the professor's face became distinct, exhibiting a brightness, no, a denial of ordinary vision, a smile that would never break forth from any interior cordiality. After 3 rounds of dense, warm, unaerated product known on this island as beer, Crouchmas went off on a mischief of his own, and Lou and the professor made their way to Renfrew's rooms at one of the lesser quadrangles, where they had lit cigars and allowed a pulse of watchful silence to elapse. What do we think about Renfrew? Will, I know you dislike him and Werfner quite a bit.
Yeah, they're like Nigel and Neville, except with responsibilities. The way I view them.
I'm interested to see where it goes. I honestly forget. I mean, I do remember some stuff about the professors from my first read of this book. That being said, I kind of forget what the significance of them ends up being. I am really curious. I do kind of have a soft spot for depictions of weirdo academics.
Sure.
You know, I was a professor for 2 years. One of my students on the like, you know, end of semester feedback thing wrote that I was a weird guy but was okay. Which I took as a pretty good compliment from because that was a dual credit class. But yeah, I mean, I don't know, just that kind of stuff always interests me, and Renfrew is really ostentatious, in a way that I find funny. Um, I am kind of curious as to like what exactly he teaches. I still don't think it's been stated. I mean, it does. He goes off on a monologue later that seems to be related to history and geography specifically. Um, but it's unclear, and it's still unclear to me though, like both of their connections to like intelligence services and the government and militaries and stuff. All of that interests me a lot. That an academic would be relied upon to do that kind of stuff for a government and stuff. Interests me not necessarily in like a way that it just, you know, it's not a personal, like I wouldn't personally want to do that. It's just that people who do that interest me. You know, DeLillo kind of addresses that kind of stuff in Point Omega, which is one of my favorite novels by him. I don't know, I just really love that kind of stuff.
Early in their conversation, he makes a reference to Mr. Crouchamus being worse than Gordon at Khartoum. This is a fascinating character from history that I had no conception of prior to reading this book. But this quote refers to Charles George Gordon. He was a British war hero and general who served on numerous fronts, but had initially made a name for himself during the Crimean War, and again while fighting in China. So there's going to be a lot of connections to the stuff that we talked about, but the first is that Crimean War that, of course, as I've mentioned before, was some of the impetus of Russia kind of wanting to get some regional power back. So he fought there. He also had a weird obsession with dying in combat when he was fighting in the Crimean War. He just kind of didn't think he was going to make it back home, so he continued to do like ever more ostentatious stuff while fighting in an effort to get himself killed, and none of it worked, but it did make his superior officers think that he was very impressive as far as a soldier goes, and to give him more responsibility. Interestingly enough, Charles Gordon was tapped after that Crimean War ended to help mark the borders between the Russian Empire and the modern Ottoman Empire in Bessarabia, and the delineation point between Ottoman Armenia and Russian Armenia. These, obviously, I don't think I need to go into the detail of why that's important, but him being partially responsible for the lines that would then be constantly debated and yelled about only a couple years later, and then eventually leading to World War I, is huge enough on its own. By 1873, he was placed in the service of the Khedive of Egypt, where he was asked to act as a diplomat more than a soldier. He was working to expand the borders of Egypt more broadly, and so as a result, the Khedivate of Egypt, which would have expanded Britain's power in the region. He would also pretty successfully suppress the slave trade in Egypt at the time. This became one of the big kind of themes of his career, that he wanted to find a way to I'm using scare quotes, civilize Africa without the suppression of the African people or the slave trade of the African people. This is like a big thing that he believed in. And he fought heavily for it, both in the Sudan and in Egypt. After this kind of kicked up as his primary focus, whenever he would encounter difficulty in doing so, he would actually often personally intercept slave convoys. And so it wasn't just a case where he thought about wanting to do something behind a desk. He actually did kind of put hammer to nail, so to speak, and help with the sort of new laws and new guidelines he was trying to promote in the region. He then was given an offer to become an agent in Africa on behalf of the Belgian king to help conquer Central Africa and work specifically in the Congo. He, for some reason, believed that the Dutch were going to treat the people of Africa well. There's actually a couple of instances that I found where he had this belief that they had convinced him that they only had the African people's best interests in mind. So he decided that he was going to go along with this, and he accepted their offer. But during his kind of travels to suppress the slave trade in Egypt, he left Egypt and he worked in the Sudan for quite a while. And the kind of local sovereign of Egypt that was really more just a vassal for the British Empire basically promised that he was going to come back, or made him promise that he was going to come back because he was well liked there. And so he said that he would, but then once the sort of sovereign of Egypt learned that he was going to go to Congo, he said, "Well, you promised me that you would come back," and so he kind of reluctantly did, but he did. As he came back, it became clear that there was escalating tensions in the Sudan, but then also escalating tensions in Egypt with the greater European powers because they had to declare bankruptcy. And so a big part of what he tried to do there during his second stint was to repair the relations between Egypt and Europe, as well as promote peace in the broader North African region through his role as Governor General of the Sudan. So once he couldn't quite affect the change that he wanted in Egypt, he went back down to the Sudan and he started to do work there as well. When he kind of ran out of room, so to speak, to try and push for greater cooperation with Europe or greater reinvestment or to fix these issues that he saw, he kind of just returned to Europe dejectedly. After his return, King Leopold tried to get him to join the Congo Association again. The Cape Colony, which is another thing that Pynchon has talked about many times, offered him a post as commander of the forces, and the governor of India offered him a position as a private secretary, all of which he declined. Instead, he chose to go back to China, and I didn't relay his China career because it's really long, and it's how he became a general, and he was very influential in sort of warfare and political events of China. In fact, they used to call him Chinese Gordon as a result of everything he did over there. He feared that there was going to be a war with Russia that broke out in China, so he decided he was going to go back there to just kind of be present in case it happened. However, England basically said, nope, you need to come back home because your presence there is actually making things worse and is being seen as an escalation. So he decided that he was going to go back home. He did a variety of different jobs and did a variety of different things across Ireland, Scotland, and England. Leopold tried to bring him to the Congo a third time. And this time he was like, yeah, I've kind of tried a bunch of other stuff. I don't have anywhere else to sort of go at this point, so I'll go down and join the Congo Association. And this is on the eve of 1884. Suddenly, as he was preparing to leave for the Congo, he was living with his sister in Southampton. But who should knock on his sister's door than W.T. Stead, the guy from the previous chapter who was responsible for organizing the seance that gave them the political or the vision of the assassination of the King of Serbia and Queen of Serbia. Died in the Titanic, responsible for a big chunk of the newspaper industry at the time. That guy knocks on his door and he begs him for an interview. He was very reluctant to ever speak on any of his sort of jobs that he had or his different kind of adventuring or warfare that he'd fought in. But eventually, W.T. Stead just wore him down, and so he tried to use the interview as an opportunity to talk about the work that he was going to go do in the Congo. But Stead kept pressing him on the issue of the Mahdi uprising in the Sudan, because that's where he had just recently come from a standpoint of sort of international posting. And the Mahdi was basically a person who declared himself to be the Islamic sort of messiah, and then he was going to usher in sort of a united kingdom of Islam. And Gordon, after trying to not go into this topic for a long time in the interview, sort of relented and decided that the response he was going to give to the current situation was by openly criticizing the policy that had been in place, which was sort of just of appeasement and ignoring what was going on, instead calling for an intervention to defeat the Mahdi before it kicked off a series of dominoes of other organizations joining the Mahdi or other regions coming to be destabilized because of this campaign that the guy was on. He feared that it was going to lead to a collapse of the broader North African region, which was important to him because he'd been working to promote unity and peace in that area for years prior to this. Stead published the interview with the headline "Chinese Gordon for the Sudan," igniting a public firestorm calling for Gordon to go to the Sudan to stop the Mahdi's uprising. Modern scholars see this as one of the first examples of a newspaper being used to manipulate public opinion into triggering a war. It is also believed that William Randolph Hearst would be inspired by this particular event, W.T. Stead's publishing of this interview, in using his neighbors to trigger the U.S. invasion of Cuba 14 years later. 7 days after the interview was published in the Pall Mall Gazette, he was sent to the Sudan by the British government, basically just against his will. And they had two things that they told him to do: organize a evacuation of the British personnel and soldiers and people loyal to us in the government, and then, if possible, find a way to form some kind of administrative government or something if the Mahdi's uprising fails, if he doesn't breach the border to Egypt, whatever may happen. And so Gordon, for some reason, and this is a case where it is argued constantly by scholars why he did this. When he showed up in the region, he called a meeting of tribal leaders in northern Sudan, and he said, "Just so you know, the British are deciding to leave. All of their loyal personnel, their money, their troops, they're all going." And what then happened is all of these tribal leaders changed allegiances from the greater European powers to the Mahdi that he was there to suppress. And this was something that Gordon had predicted would happen in his interview with Stead. He basically said that if you reveal the fact that British administration wants out, it's going to cause everyone to run into the Mahdi's arms instead of picking up arms against him. So this is something that still baffles scholars to this day as far as why he chose to do this. He then wrote to the Mahdi asking him to accept the Khedivate's authority, which was summarily denied. The Mahdi wrote to him asking him to join Islam and join him, and then he said no. And so at this point, the Mahdi pushed his military to Khartoum, and instead of leaving with the evacuation that Gordon had sort of put together, he decided that he was going to stay in Khartoum with a small group of soldiers and non-military men to organize a defense of the city it was about to come underneath siege. And that defense lasted nearly a year. Him and this just ragtag group of people fighting off the siege basically single-handedly. And reports of this over the course of that year were going back to the British island, and there was this big public outcry of, England to send more troops or to send a relief force to support this guy. But the British government was so angry that he did this in the first place that they didn't do anything. They said, we're just going to let this play out. And eventually the public backlash got so bad that they sent a relief force in to hopefully break up the siege that had happened. And it arrived 2 days after the city had fallen and Gordon had been killed, fulfilling his long ago wish to die in battle. So just a fascinating character to read about in history. I'd highly recommend everybody at least go take a look at his Wikipedia page, because all of the stuff that he was present for or accomplished is pretty crazy. But it's also interesting that Pynchon picks this character who was just some random soldier, but that got tapped to help draw the lines of these countries after a war had ended. And also that another person that he had picked from history as being influential in the development of kind of newspapers and another aspect of modern sort of life that we're used to now, crossed paths with him in a way that directly led to his death. It's just a fascinating choice on Pynchon's part to put in just sort of a throwaway line.
Well, it's especially funny because I was, been sitting here waiting for an opportunity to make a modern Major General joke. But, like, not only was he actually that, despite, not fulfilling kind of the pansy-esque implications of the song,
Mhm.
but he, like, it sounds like, at least from the research you did, it sounds like of all the people who were working in European colonies at the time, and especially of all the military men, it seems like he kind of understood the people he had to deal with better than pretty much anyone else in the time
Yeah,
period. That's really fascinating.
yeah. You can this particularly like the research if you do on his time in China is fascinating because it isn't just like what elevated him up, but a lot of it was the relationship building he engaged in with the Chinese people that led like one of the major influential voices to like put him in charge of an army there, and like they begged him to come back when the tensions were rising. So he is certainly what you're talking about, where like he did have this ability to kind of understand the people he was working alongside, or to like at least see the humanity in them, which makes it so confusing why he did what he did when he went back to the Sudan.
Yeah, I mean, it really, you gotta wonder, some of those guys working in British and other militaries by then, like, you work in the colonial military for 30 years. At some point, some of them are gonna start to suspect the whole system, I guess.
Yeah, yeah, very true. As it turns out, the professor has a favor to ask, or a job to ask for Lou to do for him, which is to locate this gentleman bomber. There's an interesting back and forth where he asks him if he recognizes him, and then he says, "I thought I did for a bit," and then the professor says, "Oh, you recognize him." To me, this just reads as like he is, as Luke said in his summary in the beginning, that this is sort of an alternate universe Kieselguhr kid, and so there's like a crossover happening in Lou's mind from that. Um, does anyone have any feelings specifically on that chunk of their conversation? Why he insists that Lou recognizes the bomber?
It this is one of those things for me that's very kind of Lynchian, where I think that it's meant to be obtuse like this, and we're not really there's not supposed to be a definitive answer, even though the Pynchon wiki goes into considerable depth as to who it could possibly be. I like the idea more so of it being like you and Luke were saying, the sort of alternate universe, the evil Kieselguhr kid, with the goatee and the darker hair,
Mhm.
um, the bad universe, the worst universe
Making
version
a
of it.
community reference now.
Yes, I've been rewatching it, so yes, I'm adult. But yeah, I think it's just one of those things. I think it's a really nice, like a good kind of unsettling scene to have, sort of your mystery man and lost highway kind of thing. Um, I don't whether it is supposed to be someone definitively, and Lou's just kind of missing it because he's so addled from the various drugs he's been doing and the
Mhm.
jumping between worlds. Who knows? I just think it makes for a really compelling scene.
Yeah, agreed.
I don't think, I don't think Lou recognizes him at all, because what we have on the page is essentially, he sees the photograph, it's a shadowy figure, and he takes a few steps back so that he can get, like, enough scale on the low quality photograph to get like a sense of what he actually looks like.
Mhm.
Um, and then he goes along with Renfrew's suggestions in the same way that, a spy would. Um, and the final line there regarding that exchange is, Lou had a gastrically dismal feeling but saw no reason to confirm the professor's guess. Now, that's ambiguous, but if we're getting the pretty specific description of his stomach dropping, but we're
Mhm.
also getting, Lou seeing no reason to confirm it. It's not saying those are two vastly different levels of like honesty. If if the implication is that he does recognize the gentleman bowler.
Yeah, that's fair.
So yeah, so it's like we're getting a very specific statement to how Lou feels, and then we're getting a very vague non-statement that can be read to imply that he has recognized the photo. So
Yeah.
it could just be him basically playing along so that Renfrew doesn't pick up on being played or whatever.
Yeah. Agreed.
I have a hard time taking Renfrew seriously in this scene. I mean, it is stated that his upper and lower jaws were moving independently at one point.
Yeah, that's a
I
great description of
Mhm.
like him as a character and how likely all of his actions are technically guided by other people. I but I agree with you that like the smarm is off the charts in everything that the man says.
yeah, like I don't. The whole like him saying that you recognize him. No, thought for a minute I might. You recognize him. Like it's slightly nodding as if to himself. It's very like weird and performative.
Mhm.
Seems like a sales job in some sort of way. To go back a little bit, I do like the line "the desert has created in him fantasies of power." I think referring to Yashmin's dad, correct? But I just love that line, just because there's a lot of biblical implications to it. So I'm sure Kate could probably of all of us talk about the best, but I also like the line, the two lines. So it's not what you call personal. Lou asks Renfrew, walking about at the seaside with Mrs. Renfrew, sort of thing. Um, which seems to be a joke. I don't. If it doesn't seem clear that there's actually a face on this picture anyway. The face was blurred. It says.
Mhm.
Um, I don't. There's just a lot of stuff about this conversation that's just very absurd, and I do enjoy it though. Like I said, I just Renfrew doesn't seem like a very serious guy in this scene, or maybe he had one too many at the pub, or he pre-gamed or something. I don't know.
Well, they did pregame their conversation with at least 4 rounds of
Yeah.
a devastating insult to real ale lovers in England.
Was it like
Yeah,
non-aerated watery?
Yeah, room temperature. Yeah, a lot of negative comments. Um, but yeah, as Luke kind of outlined, he's asking him to locate the gentleman bomber and just sort of to bring him to the professor. Lou tries to kind of do some digging and say like, "Oh, is your colleague in Germany, Werfner, just as interested as you are?" And that's when we get to the globe moment where Renfrew takes the globe down. He makes that kind of circuitous route to mention that he sees power out of the desert, where he sees that section of Asia as being important to, you know, he who controls the world, basically. Um, I think the meaning of this conversation is pretty on the page, just from a standpoint of showing what his ambition is, what he is on the side of in the Eastern question and in the Great Game, the stuff that we talked about last week. Does anyone else have any thoughts on that chunk of the conversation when it switches from just here's the assignment to of a very Lex Luthor moment of him holding a globe talking about the way the continents are connected and divided?
Funny scene. Very Doctor Evilish.
Yeah.
definitely. I was sure that the history emerges from geography line. I was sure that someone else had said that before, and I googled it, and it appears to be Pynchon is the one to coin that phrase. And from googling it, I mean, there has been some scholarly or on blogs or something response to that thesis. I do really love thinking about that as a concept. That history emerges from geography, and I would assume that somebody would have phrased it that way before Pynchon did.
Yeah, that surprises me that that didn't have an origin somewhere else.
Yeah.
I'm a little bit perplexed as to why Inner Asia is the heart. Is it just because it's the single biggest region, really? I get the idea that if you control Inner Asia, you control the planet with the benefit of hindsight. I mean,
Yeah.
These days we're all aware of the vast stores of potassium in Kazakhstan, but the actual like rare earth minerals and stuff too. It is a big deal. Central Asia is a huge part of the global economy, but I'm not sure I understand why it's particularly resonant from the viewpoint of the Arctic.
I do kind of get it. It is a little bit, I'm not 100% that you could ever have. I mean, maybe I really don't. You could have run. It talks about running heavy machinery basically across the northern pole. And I'm not 100% that could ever have been done, but I mean, it obviously couldn't be done today. I do think that it does. I mean, Central Asia isn't super close to the Suez Canal, but the Suez Canal was pretty important at around this time, which is addressed at other places in this book, I think, and then also in other books by Pynchon. It does kind of make sense to me, just in terms of like a he's supposed to be kind of like Lex Luthor, like kind of a megalomaniac, who's talking a big game. He's like, I find him convincing, I guess, in that aspect. I don't think, like I said, but I it's all based on the thesis apparently that you can run your military infrastructure across the northern pole, which again is a not a great thesis to build your whole Central Asia is so important around. But yeah,
I mean, there's a lot of cherry picking in his theory, to say the least. Australia and South America, those don't matter at all.
That is certainly a antiquated opinion at best.
Where do you think the other rare earth minerals are, Renfrew?
Yeah. From there, he makes a comment about how at some point Lou should go and meet Werfner, that he's really in for a treat, and then Lou leaves the meeting and speaks with Akon and says, "Well, he gave me a job," and this leads to an enjoyable way to end the chapter, where it says, "Then he thinks he'll be able to use you the way you folks have been doing. Oh, but we're pure of heart, you see." It might have been the residual effects of cyclamite abuse, but Lou swore he could hear an invisible room full of laughter and some applause as well. It's just a great way to end that chapter. And just kind of this guy's life, just constantly being manipulated by other people everywhere he goes for reasons he doesn't know and to ends that he can't quite figure out, at least until maybe it's too late. Any other thoughts on the chapter before we start to close out?
Just to go back to the whole Lou jumping dimensions thing, I did last week talk about how Lou's storyline hasn't connected with anyone else's, but I forgot that he does work for the Chumps of Chance for a little bit. So he could have somehow been kicked out of his past dimension into a dimension where he did something, and that's the Chumps of Chance dimension. And then he exits that dimension into the Neville and Nigel dimension. And I honestly forget. Not that it matters, because I just don't remember if that trend continues of him jumping between universes, or it's direct commentary on it. At least I kind of forget if that happens again in the book.
Mm-hmm.
But that's my little summary of it so far, where he somehow enters a fictional dimension, and then now he is back into a more realistic one, perhaps. I don't know.
I get what you're saying. I would say he's jumped into the sitcom universe.
Mhm.
And British sitcoms, not that I'm not an expert, but they can be very absurd.
Oh yes.
Definitely.
Yes, they can. Were there any funny parts that people wanted to mention that we didn't get through in the course of the episode?
I did like Lou's sort of hidden excitement at the end of the chapter about wearing costumes again.
Yeah.
Where he's like, "Does this make me a double agent? Should I start wearing a fake nose or something?"
really good. I wanted to just jump back to the description of Renfrew that Luke brought up, because it occurs to me that, yeah, sure, it describes ventriloquist dummies, but it also describes Muppets. And Muppet is the go-to insult for upper-class Brits.
So true.
And if you don't understand it, go look at any video from the House of Lords or like a press conference from one of those lords. They talk and act like Muppets. It's bizarre. But yeah, it's just that paints such a perfect picture of this absurd character.
I found Dr. DeBottle's appearance, the description of his appearance, kind of comedic. Just how, like, there's not a hair missing on his face, and it seems like he could prior have in the past been all these different had all these different jobs and stuff. I also like that the people in his workshop are either serious girls or gnomes. It says,
Yeah.
it's a fun little detail that you could probably skip past pretty easily. At the beginning of the chapter, I do like that Lou. It seems to be he's like he found himself usually moving from one shadow to another. This is a very fun visual, like a guy like hopping between shadows or something as he's walking. I don't know. I just find that kind of absurd that he was doing that or staying in the darkness all the time as much as he can. So I mean, Dr. DeBottle saying he's about to run to his bookmaker is pretty funny.
Yeah,
Definitely.
absolutely. What do we think the most Pinchon part of the chapter is?
I'd have to go with the description of Lou and Nigel and Neville's drug abuse. Just the random things that they have found in place of cyclamite.
That's a good one, yeah.
Yeah. I think for me it's the reference to Gordon. At this point I feel like a lot of mine are pretty pigeonholed into references that he makes, but I think that a lot of that just comes from the fact that I've described this before. I often, when I'm doing the research behind the historical details of the novel, I start going down like a series of either Wikipedia rabbit holes or link hopping rabbit holes where I'm like, I'm getting closer to what I know he's doing. like the more that I like refine it down, it's almost like I can see like the light at the end of the tunnel.
Yeah.
And so for me, like going through the reference to this one guy and then finding that he crossed over with another guy that he'd talked about was one of those moments where it's like, of course that's what what he's doing. And how that builds out into like these two men crossing paths builds out into a greater discussion of how like the media is used to drum up support for war, and how this one newspaper writer had an opinion on what should happen in South Sudan and who would be the right man for the job and just made that happen. That gets to like the broader discussion of special interests in these couple of chapters and all of that. Um, and yeah, I just think it's always really neat for me when I figure out the crossings of those references or historical details, and just when I get to that moment of that's why it's here, that's something that I don't get with any other author.
Yeah.
I'm gonna be not very cool and just go with the gentleman bomber of Headingley. I mean,
Fair.
he's a cricket bowler who also does Green Goblin bombs. Like, that's real pinching.
It is.
My most mentioned part is, I actually already read it out, but it's the conversation on top of 241. You recognize him? No. Thought for a minute I might. You recognize him? Sadly nodding as if to himself. I just find it very like it's funny, and it's just it's absurd. I just really like that, and I do find it like something that it does remind me of certain conversations in like Inherent Vice, and even in the movie where this person's obviously being conned and they're just kind of letting it happen.
Okay, so that brings us to quotes. Does anyone feel like they want to go first in particular?
I would like to, only because when I sat down to read through this chapter to prepare for this episode, I sat down prepared to read this chapter and then do some more reading the rest of the evening. And when I started reading this first paragraph, I then proceeded. Well, once I got to the end, I proceeded to scream, "What the fuck? How do you write like this?"
The first paragraph of the chapter.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yep. I had the same reaction, buddy.
Yeah.
Yep, me too.
So if nobody minds beyond the obvious degree.
Go for it.
Yeah.
As autumn deepened, Lou could be noticed hurrying from place to place, as if increasingly claimed by a higher argument, tensely vertical, favoring narrow black overcoats, slouch hats, and serviceable boots. The trimmed black mustache settled in along his upper lip. Despite the growing presence of electric street illumination, London in resolute municipal creep out of the realm of gas, he had begun to discover a structure to the darkness, dating from quite ancient times, perhaps well before there was any city here at all, in place all along, and little more than ratified by the extreme and unmerciful whiteness replacing the glare-free tones and composite shadows of the old illumination, with its multiplied chances for error. Even venturing out in the daylight, he found himself usually moving from one shadow to another, among quotidian frights which would only become unbearably visible with the passing of lamplighting time into the lofty electric night. Just like so beautiful, and also so dense with like illusions and stuff. I think could have picked that for the most Pynchon part too, because it's just like so much symbolism going on.
Yep. Mine's gonna be in a similar vein, but from the next page on 234, where he's describing the descent into the war room as they like scrabble through different streets in London. Lou followed them through a narrow passageway next to the shop, leading back to a mews entirely invisible from the street, whose clamor back here had become abruptly inaudible, as if a heavy door had closed. They made their way along a sort of roofed alleyway to a short flight of steps, which took them into regions somehow colder and remote from the morning light. Lou thought he heard water dripping, and utterances of wind becoming gradually louder, until at last they stood before an entry scarred and dented all over as by decades of assault. The imagery, it's a shorter paragraph than the one that Will read out, but the imagery in it I find just as dense in the imagination that it causes in the brain of imagining, and London is more or less like this, but imagining a city that is so old and so dense and built on top of each other that you can like penetrate this outer layer to get to another layer that's like colder and darker and everything's older, and it's something that you have to like work to get towards.
Yeah.
And then just that final description of the door as being dented all over as if by decades of assault is just so meaningful. It's such an amazing chunk of the chapter. All the stuff that he does in describing London or the environs are
Yeah, maybe I should go next then, because mine is on the next page.
nice.
This is when Lou and Nigel and Neville are going into Dr. DeBottle's lab. Electrical arcs stabbed through the violet dusk. Heated solutions groaned toward their boiling points. Bubbles rose helically through luminous green liquids. Miniature explosions occurred in distant corners of the facility, sending up showers of glass as nearby workers cowered beneath seaside umbrellas set up just for protection. Gauge needles oscillated feverishly, sensitive flames sang at different pitches. Amid a gleaming clutter of burners and spectroscopes, funnels and flasks, centrifugal and soxhlet extractors and distillation columns, both the Glunsky and Labelle Henninger formats, serious girls with their hair in snoods entered numbers into logbooks and pale gnomes. Patient as lockpickers squinted through loops, adjusting tremblers and timers with tiny screwdrivers and forceps. Best of all, somebody in here was making coffee. Luke mentioned that as being a funny part that we glossed over, and it absolutely is the idea of the gnomes just being there, and it's not a big deal. And then someone, best of all, someone's making coffee. But I love this paragraph is made up. You have these two shorter sentences that are doing a lot of work in describing. It's very Hemingway-esque, whatever. It's very, very reminiscent of Hemingway's writing. And then those are both followed up by this very long, flowing, descriptive passage that builds on top of what those two sentences before it were doing. And then it's all wrapped up at the end here with this just very short and succinct. Best of all, somebody was making coffee. I love it.
Yeah, very good.
Yeah, that was gonna be mine actually.
Well, Will stole mine, so I got to steal someone's.
Someone was going to use that first paragraph, and it was going to steal from someone else. 100%.
Wasn't going to be surprised if all of us had that.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's a good point. It's just I won't actually read it all out. It's just the conversation at the end of 235, where DeBottle and Lou seem to both be like DeBottle seems to be feeling Lou out on his feelings about anarchism and is possibly positive about it, but it's also like he's kind of messing with him possibly. That's just really fun to think about, and it's a very Pinchonian thing to include, where somebody is like sympathizing with the enemy, but also maybe just seeing if you sympathize with the enemy.
Yeah.
So we do have some correspondence. We have 2 YouTube comments, and we also have an email. I'll start out with the email because it's mildly directed at me. It is from our listener who had emailed us a couple of weeks ago talking about music recommendations and finding the show through the Bleeding Edge intros. He followed up with us after our response on that episode, and he said, "Good afternoon. Thank you for the sharing of my email and invited engagement. Whatnot, super cool. Love the music recommendations and your response. Something I am wondering. I have not listened to all of the more recent episodes, so may have missed it. But Kate, how excited were you when Shadow Ticket was announced and that some of it would be set in Wisconsin?" Thank you for writing back to us, and I'm glad you liked our music recommendations. I was super excited about it because I'm sure you're probably making that reference based on the fact that I quite enjoy the reverence with which he writes about the Midwest in a chunk of Bleeding Edge. And I think that that's something that he's kind of circled around a lot, like the Midwest as a place and some feelings of positivity that he clearly has for it. As someone who lives in Wisconsin and has for most of, well, about half of their life now, I think, Milwaukee's super underrated. Like it's a pretty cool city to hang out in for, a week. If you're not in Wisconsin proper and can't visit it. So and it's also got a fair amount of like pretty interesting history, from a perspective of manufacturing and culture in the US, and was also like was and is very, very heavily segregated still. So I think that especially from the time frame that the character's coming out of and sort of what the city may have looked like and sort of been conceived like at the time, I think it provides a really, really great backdrop for um, that novel that he's going to be publishing here pretty shortly. And I'm really excited to see how he renders the city, because even if he ends up spending most of the book in Hungary, which I imagine is the case, the reality is that pretty much anywhere where a character goes, whether they start there or go there at some point later in the book, Pynchon includes these like paragraphs or sentences that describe that place really, really well. We just read out some of the examples of that in London. So I'm curious to see how he renders Milwaukee and how he describes it. But yes, I am very excited conceptually for that to be included, because of the fact that it does appear as though he has a soft spot for the Midwest in his heart. And I'd like to think that him choosing Milwaukee, proves that that's the case. Does someone want to read out the comment from Superintendent?
Yeah, I got it right here. So this is from the superintendent. Not sure of their actual credentials, but this is their YouTube comment. Here. Thank you, Kate. The work you put in is absolutely amazing. Delivered in such a, some might say, engrossing and teacherly manner too. You rock. And obviously, we definitely agree with that. We talked about that last episode, and you did it again today. You have delivered more information that I don't think anybody had known about, and it makes for such a, it adds so much to the reading. So again, thank you. We appreciate it, and thank you, the superintendent.
Yeah, thank you for your lovely compliment. And then lastly, we have a comment from the King Lud. Luke or Will, does one of you want to read that?
So this one's from @thekinglud on YouTube. Heart emoji, love you all. I've been having a lot of fun reading along, and I'm finally all caught up. Another 3 quarters to go. Yeah, that I think that sums up how we're feeling right now. It's a lot of fun, still terrifying.
Yeah.
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 We're 25% of the way
Yeah,
through, and
thanks for writing in, and hopefully
hopefully the podcast makes it to the end of the book.
hopefully we all are still sane by the end of the book.
Yeah. I can't believe we haven't even crossed the 300 mark yet.
Yeah. We'll get
That's wild.
it's honestly going faster than I thought at this point.
Really?
Yeah.
Okay. It has been a lot of fun, genuinely.
has.
But this book seems to be more work than every other one that we have done. Certainly.
I'm curious if there's any other podcast that has dedicated as much time to one book as we are doing for this one. Just of any
sure.
book. I'm curious.
By the time we're done, probably not.
Yeah,
Currently, yes,
Currently,
definitely.
yeah, for sure. But we're going to be putting in a good 3 years on this thing at least.
Yeah.
So.
Yeah. All right, that brings us to the end of our episode. Next week we'll be doing chapter 21. Cody, do you have the page number and final quote for folks with a different pagination?
I do. This runs from page 242 to 259, ending with the line, "Bells are the most ancient objects. They call to us out of eternity."
All right. So that's where we'll be reading to. As always, thank you guys for listening. If you think our show is worth $1, we'd love to have that dollar. A slogan that I will continue to rip off from hardcore history. We can be reached for any donations on our Ko-Fi account at Mapping the Zone. And again, any money that's donated to us will be used to pay for hosting fees and upgrade equipment and just kind of keep the show running. We had a lot of donations after the last episode. A lot more than I would say is usual we upload an episode. So thank you to everyone in particular who very clearly either heard that episode and was inspired or have been thinking about it for a while. We greatly appreciate you guys. I have neglected to mention on the last couple episodes, but we also have a merch store now that you can find on Spreadshirt. We're there at Mapping the Zone podcast. And there are a number of different great products that you can get. Shirts, coffee mugs, stickers. I think there's a random carry-all bag on there. Got tote bags. If you happen to be a tote bag person, a lot of good stuff on our Spreadshirt. And if you have any questions, comments, or feedback for the show, or just want to drop us a line, there are a number of different ways to do so. We are on Twitter at PinchOnPod. We are on Blue Sky at Mapping the Zone. We are also on Instagram at Mapping the Zone, and our email address is mappingthezonepodcast@gmail.com. So anything that you may have that you want to share with us or ask about, or crazy conspiracy corner theories of your own, you can feel more than welcome sending those to us, and we'll read them out on the show unless you specifically ask us. That is always an option for anyone who doesn't want their text, actually read out, and we'll still reply. So yeah, without any further ado, thank you for listening, and we will see you 2 weeks from now.
Bye.
Bye.
Yeah.
Bye.